Welcome to the new influentials of the GOP, Gen Y and Gen Z. This is part of a continuing series on the future of the right brought to you by the Washington Examiner and the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management. Today for this conversation, I'm joined by three absolute rising stars on the right, and I'm excited to introduce you to them. First, we're going to be joined by Elisha Krauss. She is a contributor at the Washington Examiner, and she runs our Newsmakers series here at the Examiner. You should always tune in to check out her interviews with those who are making policy and making news here in Washington. Elisha, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning.
I'm also joined today by John Olds, Executive Director of Gen Z GOP. John, thank you so much for joining.
Good to be here.
And I'm also joined by Garrison Coward, Managing Partner at Merger Partners, Inc. Garrison, thanks for joining the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start off with a question, and Garrison, I'll kick it to you first, which is, over the last 2 decades, the Republican Party, at least at the national level, has struggled to win younger voters. But there have been times in the past, say when Ronald Reagan was president, where Republicans did quite well, winning young voters by double-digit margins. But that doesn't mean that all young people are progressive or that majorities of young people agree with the progressive view on every issue. So where do you see the greatest alignment between your generation and today's Republican Party?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And thank you for starting with me. I think ultimately, look, we believe in equal opportunity and not equal outcomes. And I think that's where the party truly does align with the current generation. People want to make sure that they've got a lower cost of living. They've got more access to jobs and better and affordable health care. And these are all things that are on the Republican Party's platform.
John, how about you? When you are working on Gen Z GOP and talking to folks from your generation, where do you find the greatest alignment or the most opportunity to really start those conversations with young people?
Yeah, and thank you very much to the Examiner and to GSPM for hosting this event. In terms of my conversations, most of them occur on college campuses. The biggest thing that I hear from young people, especially young people that might not be necessarily political, is that they see the left as just so out of touch with general common sense. And what I mean by that is so many people, so many students feel disaffected by both sides. And right now you have a situation where both Republicans and Democrats are seen by the Generation Z as just beyond the pale. And Republicans, first and foremost, if they can come to the table as being seen as the more sane choice, that is thing number one. Number two, really quickly, our generation, one of the really funny phrases we've heard throughout this pandemic is the Renaissance came after the plague. And our generation they have a tremendous ingenuity and tremendous drive to create new things, new startups with new ideas. And right now, the Republican Party has the opportunity to kind of grease the skids for those people to go out, create a business, create new jobs, create new opportunities for people. And that's where I see on a policy front where the GOP can be the most in line with the younger generation.
Elisha, what's your reaction to that? What do you see as the biggest opportunities for Republicans to have a conversation with millennials or those in Gen Z?
Yeah, I would totally agree with what the guy said. In pre-COVID, I was frequently speaking via YAF on college campuses across the country. And our generation is very innovative, very entrepreneurial, very kind of self-taught, even if people do go and get that higher education at a university or college campus that's now shuttered due to COVID. And I think that as they enter the quote unquote real world past school, they're recognizing that leftist government does a lot to try to stifle their creativity and growth. And conservative thought is actually going to minimize the government's involvement in being able to stop them from pursuing their dreams. And so I definitely see that as a gateway to reach not only young people, but minorities, women across the age spectrum, and also immigrants and others.
Now, a lot of this is talking about sort of how the left has lost young people, that even though they've had in some ways a little bit of electoral success with young people, particularly during the Obama years, had quite a lot of success with young people, that nowadays there is a divide between perhaps where the bulk of young people are at and where the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party is. But there still are challenges with regards to the GOP. And I'm curious about your take on what you think young people see as the Republican Party's top priorities. I know from my research that it tends to be issues like immigration. It tends to be issues like free speech or with the, liberal media bias. Those are things I hear Republicans talk about a lot. Are those the same priorities that young people have, or are there other areas where there's the most overlap and opportunity? Elisha, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think that the free speech thing is actually where your data and what's happening on college campuses and on social media and in real life to people now, we've seen 2020 and 2021, is starting to affect even people of the left and even people that would consider themselves more libertarian or liberal. So I think that that is an issue. If the GOP can do it well, I think some of their messaging or some of the kind of heroes and heroines that they decide to choose to be their leaders in that area are a problem. I think that unfortunately, even conservative leaning Gen Ys and Gen Xers and beyond look at the GOP and do think that it is a very Beltway, Wall Street ridden and controlled party. And I think that the GOP definitely needs to change the face of their messaging, the face of their spokespeople and their talking points to reach out to those younger voters and appeal to them beyond the kind of old white dude that you envision making deals in the back room at the cigar bar.
Garrison, what do you think about this notion that the issue of free speech and changing norms around who can say what and when, that may be in some ways drawing more young people to the right, even though it seems like it's a movement that's in some ways driven by young people to change those norms?
Absolutely. No, that's something that obviously you see in your data. And I'm a big data-driven individual. Like at least data tells you directionally where a population may be. And that's exactly right. People are tired of, whether it be social media censorship or just censorship in general. The foundation of our Constitution, really our union here, is founded on the First Amendment, which is, hey, you've got the right and the freedom to assemble, and you've got the right to express your views without being, I guess, shamed for them, right? And I think that is something that folks in our generation, they will be attracted to our party. But again, going back to what Erica said, the ultimate test is, how do we make sure that we're presenting a face of not only minorities, but women, and just a group of just a totally different view of what the notion of the GOP used to be, right? And that is this misconception that it's a party for old white folks, and that's just not the case. And I think,
yeah. If I can just add on to that too, because I had a speech the other day in which I talked to people about, I think that as Republicans, we can use emotion to kind of reel people in, because there's real stories of situations where government has hurt and not helped people. I mean, we can look at the she session that we've seen during COVID and how women more hand over fist are negatively affected, whether it's weight gain or depression and anxiety, loss of jobs, having to educate their children at home. The list goes on and on that we could be pointing to. And I look at even California, where I am here in Los Angeles, neighboring areas were able to flip Democratic seats using Asian immigrants in the Republican Party that were small female business owners, flip seats. And I think if we look at some of the down ballot races that we had and the seats that we were able to flip, I mean, God bless Elise Stefanik for all the work that she did and her success. I'm starting to call her like our generation's architect. Sorry, Karl Rove, because if we get involved in those races and choose people, not just because of their gender or their ethnicity, but also their core conservative principles, I think that the messenger does matter. And that's how we can win people to our side.
Absolutely.
John, I want to pose the next question to you and sort of shift the focus a little bit, which is on how the party views young people. So we've just talked a little bit about how do young people view the GOP and where are the greatest areas of opportunity. But I know a decade ago when I was really starting to talk a lot about the importance of making sure that Republicans are reaching out to young voters, there were a lot of folks who were consultants that had been around for a long time that said, it's very adorable, but young voters aren't that big a deal. They'll move to voting more Republican when they get older. They don't vote anyways. This doesn't matter. And I think we've seen over the last decade or so that they really do matter, and that oftentimes they'll hold on to their political views even as they age. What is your message to those leading the Republican Party who might be dismissive of, well, why should I worry about Gen Z? They don't turn out to vote anyways.
Well, the short answer to that is you're wrong. In 2020, voters ages 18 to 29 turned out at I believe it's a 55% rate. That's the highest that number's ever been, or it's been in recent memory at least. That's a pretty high turnout, and that's only going to go up as Generation Z gets older. So right now, what you're seeing is it's a two-way street of being unengaged. Right now, the Republican Party, for the most part, or at least it's perceived to be, unengaged on a lot of the issues that young people care about. And I know it sounds sort of taboo to be talking about this in a Republican discussion, but things like student debt, things like the environment, things like racial injustice, those are things that matter to young people. And for better or for worse, the Republican Party needs to at least have some sort of voice on those issues. Now, in the same way, the Republican Party seems to think that young voters are unengaged, that they're sort of, pierced, half-shaved, blue-headed people on college campuses who don't really vote and they don't really think about anything political. And that's just not true at all either. As I said, they are starting to vote. And as more and more people get older, more and more people become of voting age, their point of engagement is going to be Republicans bad if we don't change course.
Garrison, what's your take on this? What would your message be to any Republican candidate or party leader who is questioning whether or not focusing on younger voters really matters that much these days?
Yeah, look, and I don't think my answer is going to be much different than Elisha or John's. ultimately, when I ran in 2019 for the Virginia House of Delegates, I saw this in spades, and John couldn't be further from the truth. He couldn't be more correct. In 2020, you saw the numbers of young folks, millennials, ages 18 to 29. They voted 52 to 55%. I mean, that is a huge chunk of the voting population, and I wouldn't want to be running for office ignoring those type of numbers out there at all. So I think ultimately it's incumbent upon the new leaders of the party to push back against kind of those old school thoughts and reevaluate and reimagine how we're actually engaging with these voters of all stripes, of all ages.
And if I could just piggyback on that, I agree 1,000%. And my frustration with the GOP has always been that it's like, what is the issue that's in the news cycle right now? What is the issue that's going to affect us in 2016? And it's always like that next election cycle, like, okay, these midterms, once we get through that, then we got to plan for the next presidential race and then go on from there. We need to be thinking generationally, like not just our generation, but my daughter's generation and beyond. And I think that this is something that the Democratic Party has done well, and they've been able to shift and manipulate and control the conversation and really control what people find interesting or tugs at the heartstrings. And the GOP has historically failed at that. So we need to pivot, not just so hopefully we can get people like Garrison elected one day sooner rather than later, but for the generations beyond, like 20 years from now, 40 years from now, what conversations are we going to be having in politics in the 24/7 news cycle, and what is the GOP going to do about it?
I also am fascinated with the idea that, we think about the way political participation happens is in terms of voting. And as a pollster, first and foremost, that's a big way we think about things in my industry. Who's going to vote for whom and will they turn out to vote? But there are lots of other methods of political engagement, sharing content on social media to make your voice heard. These are things that in some ways progressives have been quite good at in terms of reaching young people for a long time. But the right seems to be catching up. Elisha, in your engagement with young conservative activists, what are the tools that you are finding they are the most excited to use, or areas where you think that the Republican young activists may have an advantage over those on the left?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you can see content on social media that is not political at all. And sometimes it can even be purveying, I think, a pro-life or a pro-family message, which tend to be, talking points and platform points of the Republican Party. And then you have people definitely in certain like Catholic communities, for example, using makeup and fashion to talk about celibacy and pro-life issues and the beauty of marriage and family, that, it comes from a more kind of tender, visually appealing aesthetic because it's about fashion and makeup, right? But then you also have kids that are really leaning to, and I say kids and it makes me feel old because I'm a grandma millennial over here, but that are really leaning to this free speech and equality of opportunity language of making sure that we are operating with real tolerance and not just saying that we're tolerant while we go about judging everybody and trying to cancel them. That is picking up steam. I think, as you mentioned, though, the left has us beat here because they own a lot of the media, they own a lot of the industry that I just mentioned, and they have owned the messaging and the people who are the messengers, like all of Hollywood A-listers, for a very long time. So it will be interesting to see the people that are willing to come out and kind of expose themselves as having these same political thoughts, or if this is going to be kind of a new type of social media influencer that arises over the next couple of years to talk and be more of that Republican influencer face on social.
So there's the question of to what extent the parties are focused on winning young people, but there's also the question of to what extent are the parties letting young people lead them. Even though there's this stereotype that Democrats, are more the party of young people, if you look at their leadership in Congress, for instance, it's not necessarily the youngest group of folks. It's many who have been around for a long time. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, there are a number of folks that have tried to sort of steer the party in a new direction, who come from a younger generation. So my question for you, and John, I'll start with you on this one since you're doing this work on campuses. Where do you see the young people today who do identify as Republicans, who they're already bought in on the message? Where are they going to lead the party in the future? How will the Republican Party look different once your generation is in charge?
Well, there does seem to be a bit of a conflict. I know that, we would be remiss to not address the elephant of the room, whether or not the party is going to go in a more Trumpy populist direction or, kind of return to its roots. But the way I see it is it's not really going to be either of those things. At Gen Z GOP, we have a really diverse, really smart group of people that is trying to bring not only thought leadership, but elevate a lot of voices that are going to be ready to bring these issues that the GOP has been for so long unengaged on into the forefront. We hosted a town hall, for example, with the mayor of Oklahoma City and the mayor of Stockton, California. Stockton, California elected a Republican mayor for the first time in forever. And he came on and he talked about the issue of homelessness in his city. Now, when was the last time you heard a Republican talk about homelessness? It's that direction that we're going to have to go in order to win these younger voters, because young voters see the world as interconnected. Now, I just want to address a point that we talked about earlier in terms of modes of communication, because I don't think the answer to communicating to young voters is to put Kevin McCarthy on TikTok or Twitch. I think that would just be a little weird. But I do think taking some of the stylistic points of someone that you polled recently, Kristen, Dave Portnoy of Barstool Sports, he sort of brings this unvarnished, sometimes it's a little crass analysis to a bunch of things, not just sports, but, cultural things as well. And I think a lot of people in my generation relate to him because he is just he brings common sense to the table. And that's where I also see the future of conservatism going as well, because, are we going to win these culture war battles by lecturing to kids who already don't believe that the culture war is something that conservatives are right on? Of course not. But if we bring common sense, if we bring that sort of Portnoy energy to the table, then we might actually start winning hearts and minds. Because I know every single one of my buddies watches Dave Portnoy or listens to a Barstool podcast or something along those lines. And I bet they all voted for Biden. And that's a problem. And we need to reconcile that.
If I can just piggyback on that too, I think that it's important that we rise up and encourage people. Like, obviously we're all political nerds and politics is so important. And I think that politics is local, as you just referenced with that mayoral race. And I think but we can also just work on creating good content. Like, it doesn't have to be labeled conservative content or Republican content. And I would argue that somebody like a Gary Vee is definitely of the left, but a lot of what he espouses when it comes to marketing and communication and growing your business, I think are small government, very Republican Party type principles. Dave Portnoy, as you mentioned, he's a little crass and crazy. Joe Rogan, definitely. I mean, he was a Bernie Sanders supporter, but he still talks to people from the other side. So I'm fans of those type of people growing their reach and growing their audience, because then they become unable to be broken by the woke mob of the left that is eventually going to come to them when they say something that they don't agree with. But they're still espousing truths and revealing truths and having good dialogues and conversations about the realness of the world. And that's where I think that if the Republican Party could also be putting forward good messengers along those lines to kind of pick up the people. My husband likes to joke that he's like, you know, Joe Rogan is the gateway drug to Jordan Peterson, and then eventually you get to Ben Shapiro. Maybe we could add Dave Portnoy to that lineup, because I think that it's totally true. And so once they get to somebody like a Ben, or once they get to somebody else, you know, like with the Washington Examiner or the Blaze or anywhere else, like you want to be able to present them with those hard facts that you hope will win them over.
This is reminding me a little bit of a Clubhouse session. So for those who may not know, Clubhouse is a new app that exists where people can have audio only sort of casual conversations. And I dropped into a room that was talking about, like, why is conservative content so cringe? And it was young activists trying to sort of unpack why so much of what they see online that is called conservative content for young people is cringeworthy. And their diagnosis was essentially that it's a lot of older conservative activists trying to create things that they think young people will like, and are ultimately just creating stuff for grandparents to send to their grandkids. That, like, the ultimate audience for a lot of young conservative content is older people, so that they can say, hey, this is so right, I'm going to send it to my grandkids. Garrison, what's your reaction to that? Do you think that young people are actually in the driver's seat when it comes to a lot of conservative efforts to reach young people? Or is it old people trying to win young people with what they think will work?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. If we're being real, you know, ultimately what you're seeing is a mix of the older folks who may not understand some of the new technologies, trying to put their spin on what might work. But similar to what Elisha and John just stated, you know, the bottom line is you've got to get back to issues. You've got to let people know that you care. Otherwise, they really don't care about what you have to say. And then you've got to go and meet them on their specific medium. So Clubhouse is a great example, right? Once you look at little apps like Clubhouse, and then try to look at how do you tie in other social media platforms to actually go out there and get votes. And then obviously you have an advertising component on top of that. But just going back to the core, I think you've got to get away from labels, right? I think ultimately people are just sick and tired of being called a conservative or a rhino or a moderate or a liberal, or, you know, whatever, pick your label that we've come to ascribe folks to in the political scene. And you've got to just get back to centers of influencers and people who can actually transcend politics, and then bring them into the fold as to, you know, why the Republican Party is the party for them to be a part of. So I think a big piece of this is the messenger, but then the other piece of it is you just got to get out there and make sure that we're messaging things that people actually care about.
Garrison, I want to follow up with you because both Elisha and John mentioned state and local issues as being a potential interesting gateway for Republicans to have a more productive conversation with young people. And you've worked in politics and run for office and been a part of this at the state level. What's your take on the idea that actually, rather than this focus on federal issues and what's going on with, you know, the presidential campaign or Trump or not Trump, that actually it's the state and local level where more of these inroads can be made?
100%. You know, in my role right now with Glenn Youngkin in the gubernatorial race, you're seeing this, right? Ultimately, people care about what they see on TV. That's where they get their fire. That's where they get the burn. But then when you actually get down on the local level, this is where when the protests are happening, when you know, schools are closed, who do you turn to, right? You don't necessarily turn to the federal government. You turn to your state and your local municipalities. So you're definitely seeing a large trend towards those state and local issues. Now, people still get riled up about Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy, because unfortunately, in this 24/7 news cycle that we have, you know, people are sitting at home on their TVs watching cable news. But ultimately, in terms of the issues and where you can make the greatest impact, absolutely on the state and local level is where that's happening.
I want to throw the next question out to all three of you, so feel free to jump in. The next question I have is, who are the young rising leaders in the party that you are following and are the most excited about? Present company excluded. Who are some names, candidates, folks that you see on the rise who you think are important and influential voices that we're going to be hearing a lot more from in the next decade?
Here in California, with the successful recall, or looking like the successful recall of our awful Governor Gavin Newsom, I have to give credit to a state assemblyman from the Sacramento area, and young by political standards, because he's in his 30s, Kevin Kiley, who I interviewed last week for the Newsmaker series at the Examiner. I think that he is very fiscally sound as a conservative. He definitely has a passion for the state and for his district and in turning things around here. And I think with him helping spearhead this successful recall campaign, he's kind of made a little bit of national buzz, but there's opportunity for much more. Of course, we also think of I think of like an Elise Stefanik, who I think have appropriately dubbed the new architect for our generation, whose PAC is doing a lot and had a very successful rate of helping create amazing candidates and support those candidates to big wins. And I hope that she continues to do that. And I mean, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention, of course, Dan Crenshaw as well, who's made a name for himself, who really pumps out a lot of content too. Speaking back to that content, I think that he does a good job on his social media, in which he has millions of followers combined across all platforms and is continuing to grow that, but will still write a very decent policy response op-ed for the Washington Examiner, right? So I think that he kind of hits all those key points as well, but that's who I'm keeping an eye on.
John, how about you?
For me, I look to the great state of Michigan and Peter Meyer. I think that he's taken some controversial votes in the past, but I think that the demeanor that he brings, he's always on Clubhouse. That's kind of that was like my point of engagement with Congressman Meyer. He definitely appreciates the ability to communicate effectively with young people as well. And then the other thing that I'll mention too, they're not policy makers per se, but the young campaign managers, campaign staffers, the volunteers. There are a lot of young conservatives out there that are hungry, that are ready to go knock doors, make phone calls, and usher in this new future of conservatism. And we need to look to them. We need to value their input. And those are the people that I work with at Gen Z GOP, that are going to move the party into the future.
Garrison, you are one of those young campaign managers, but again, present company excluded. Who are the other folks that you are looking at as potential rising stars in the GOP that come from either your generation or the millennial generation?
Well, I think present company must be highlighted once again. You with your work in the polling industry, and John and what you're doing, and Elisha, you're going to run one day. I can just feel it. But ultimately, I too have to go back to the state and local levels, right? Because I think that's where folks are kind of getting their feet wet, and they're making headways in a very, very good way. I look at someone like an Emily Brewer or Delegate Carrie Coyner, but on the national level too, Elise Stefanik. I mean, and then Dan Crenshaw. No matter where you really think his politics lie, ultimately he's been. If you look at some of his campaign videos and his commercials and the way that he's communicating in just a different way, it's pretty impressive to watch. But I too, like John, I'm living it, I'm breathing it right now every single day, and the door knockers, the volunteers, the campaign managers, the advisors, the comms folks. I mean, there's a lot of good talent coming down the pipeline for us in the Republican Party.
So as we come to the end of our discussion, I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about the advice that you would give to Republican leaders to help them move in a more productive direction, to have a better conversation with people of your generation. And so the first question within that I want to ask is, what is the biggest myth or misconception you would love to debunk that you think people have about your generation, that you think would be important for, myth busting in order to really help the GOP understand how to do a better job?
I can start on that. I mentioned it at the outset. I think the biggest myth is that Gen Z is lazy. Mm-hmm. And I just think that couldn't be further from the truth. I have so many good friends of mine that started businesses, started nonprofits in high school because they understood the value of being their own boss and being able to take a dream or an idea they had and make it materialize. And I think that's uniquely American. I think the second thing is that Gen Z hates America. I think that also couldn't be further from the truth. I think as Americans, we innately love our country, and we just, it might be covered by some veils for some folks, but ultimately right now what we're seeing, even in terms of the vaccination effort, and I say this to my friends who are on the liberal side of the spectrum, right now we're seeing the fruits of labor from both Republican president and a Democratic president. And that should make us proud. We're doing something that's uniquely American. We brought in a modern scientific miracle into the world that's going to save us. And I think that as conservatives, we should we should do whatever we can to get our liberal friends to appreciate that that is American exceptionalism playing out before our lives. With every shot that goes into arms, we are experiencing an American moment for the 21st century. We should relish in that, we should cultivate it, and we should do it whatever we can with it to change hearts and minds.
I'd like to add to that, and maybe I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because I am a college dropout. That's why I love the micro Gary Vee mindset of it's not necessary. But I think that leaders in the GOP need to understand that you don't have to be Ivy League educated in order to be considered a valued voter, or even potentially down the road a valued donor.
Garrison, how about you?
I think, again, going back to what John stated, it's ultimately this idea that we don't care. And I think that's just, it's a false sense of reality, and it's something that's going to bite us in the behind later on down the road. But I think ultimately this idea that there's a cookie cutter, perfect, I guess, clone of what a politician should be these days, it does not exist.
All right, so final question. Let's say you are all sitting down in a room and you've got an audience in front of you that includes Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, and Ronna McDaniel. What's your message to them? What's your elevator pitch to them of what they should do with the Republican Party to reach young voters? Garrison, we'll start with you.
Meet them where they are and do not dismiss them in order to win all of your majorities back, frankly.
John, what would your message to those three folks be?
It's very similar to Garrison. Understand that young people view a number of issues as interconnected, and right now they view you as people who don't care about them. So whatever you can do to engage on those issues, do it.
Elisha, last words to you.
I would say that communication is key, and that you can change the way that you communicate them without changing your core principles.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for joining me for this discussion today. Elisha, John, Garrison, you guys have been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I've been talking to Elisha Krauss, contributor to the Washington Examiner and host of our Newsmaker series, John Olds of Gen Z GOP, and Garrison Coward, managing partner of Merger Partners Incorporated. Thank you so much for joining us for this series brought to you by the Washington Examiner in partnership with the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management. I've been your host, Kristen Soltis Anderson, contributor here at the Washington Examiner. Thanks so much for tuning in.